Welcome.
Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, you've had an incredible career in tech. You've been through a lot of these hype cycles, a lot of these waves, mobile, obviously. And I'm curious, you've been at Anthropic now a few months?
7 months, yeah.
Yeah. What are your impressions? What made you want to join Anthropic? What's it been like?
Yeah, I mean, like flashback to Instagram, I think the thing that we got right was something was happening, which was cell phone adoption, camera adoption, cell phone networks getting good enough that you would actually think about, going out and using a social network on the go. And I felt a similar kind of shift, which was not a novel thought. That's why there's a whole conference here. But starting kind of halfway through the second company that I was working on called Artifact, same co-founder as Instagram. And I had two experiences that were like my whoa moments. One was starting to code with AI, and I've always loved to build. And this was before a lot of things were in place. Like definitely no editors like Cursor or Windsurf or anything like that. But what I started doing is like writing really detailed prompts. And this was before even multimodal input, so you couldn't put images into the models. I would draw like little like text art of the screens I was trying to build in Artifact, hit enter, and it was pretty slow at the time. Again, it was last year. And I would go downstairs, get a coffee, come back, and it would have generated like something that was 80% of the way there. And in your head, you're like, I have a very convoluted, hacky process. What does this look like a year from now? And you could see where that direction was going to go. And then the second one, so part of what we were doing with Artifact closer to the end of the company was using some of these LLM APIs to summarize articles or make friendlier headlines or personalized content, and things that would have taken me months to build. That's probably underselling it because I have to then recruit the team first. We're done in an afternoon, and you could prototype and build really quickly. So like that confluence of two things, how quickly things were going to get built differently, and then also the kinds of products that were unlocked when all of a sudden you had access to LLMs doing the work that otherwise would have taken months to train a model. We're both like, okay, I need to be closer to this work. So as Artifact wound down, my biggest criteria of what I wanted to do next was get closer to the models, but be somewhere that I felt really aligned with the mission, and then that confluence of things led me to Anthropic.
And talk a little bit about sort of where we are. And we started the day, I asked these questions, where are we in the AI revolution? What's working, what isn't? From your perspective, it seems to me you're on the optimistic side that, maybe it's 80% of the way, but that's a lot of value. Do you see the technology continuing to get better enough to take on more and more tasks? Again, one of the things I said at the beginning was, some days I wake up and I'm super excited. There's a million things I can think of doing. And then other days I'm like, it's still drawing, 6 fingers on the hands. Enough details are wrong that the images aren't what I need. It's not writing, enough. Where are we from your perspective, and how many obstacles do you see in the near-term road?
Yeah, I think I'm generally optimistic. Maybe I'll illustrate it from a user research study that I watched about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I thought this was really illustrative. It was a participant, and they came in, they had some experience with Claude, but they weren't a super power user of Claude or Anthropic products, and the researcher asked her to, all right, what's something you're trying to do at work right now? And they were composing like a kind of basic agreement to send out to a vendor. And she's like, well, why don't you try using Claude for it? And she typed in like some kind of simple prompt and hit enter, and it generated something that was like pretty generic, because all she had told the model was, hey, I need a vendor agreement. And she's like, oh, okay, and like her face, you could kind of read between the lines, like, could have downloaded this off of Google in like 5 minutes. This is not actually better. And then the researcher says, can you give it a few more details? And obviously this is a pretty guided research trip, but
Yep.
This is showing the bugs or the sort of limitations in what we need to do better. And then she does a couple of refinements and then hits enter, and then it generates something that is like basically there. And her eyes open and she goes, please don't tell my boss, which was such an interesting moment where you're like that did not take 2 hours. I like to talk about how success with AI comes from the model layer, the right context into the models, and then the right UI and the right prompting to get the right data out of it. And you could tell that our models, Anthropic builds some of the best models in the world, but until we get those other two right, it'll still be, that cliche, the future is here, it's not just evenly distributed. I think it's the future is here, just not everybody knows how to use it yet. And that's what excited me about coming on and doing product at an AI company, which is how do we get it so that first of all, she shouldn't have to like know that you need to provide more details. The model should get her there interactively. And second of all, like, is chatting with a model even the right initial UI? Can we do something better? Can we like have a friendlier way of approaching it? So I think directly to answer your question, I'm optimistic. I think we have so much work to do though, so that it's not just a thing that like the nerds like me know how to exactly prompt, but it's something that it's accessible to more people.
But you hit on something that I've been talking to a lot of people about, and some really smart folks that I know tend to agree too, which is, yes, there's a bunch of improvements yet to be made on the models, but even if for some reason there's a calamity, we got no new models, we could probably spend 10 years just creating more tailored interfaces and better ways of using that. Yeah. My sense is a lot of the disappointments in generative AI come when we ask it to do too broad a task, and we put it in the most generic tool we can think of. So, there's still a lot of people that their use of generative AI is, let me go to ChatGPT or sometimes Anthropic, type in, a generic prompt with no additional files or data. And again, it's that initial, it's kind of there. Whereas if you build it into the workflow, and I'm curious from Anthropic, like, do you want to be doing all of that? Do you think that there's just the models and let the rest of the world do it? Or do you want to take on some of that work of building different interfaces?
Yeah, I completely agree, by the way. I tell our product team, like, we love our researchers, but if they were like cryogenically frozen for 5 years, like we should have at least 5 to 10 years of work. And maybe as a quick stat to illustrate this, there's a benchmark called SWE-bench, which is basically how well do these models do like an agentic coding task, like a coding task from end to end, like take a bug, go all the way to solution. And what I think is really interesting is like Sonnet, which is our latest model, our 3.5 Sonnet, scored a 48. The current top of the leaderboard is 62% of the benchmark. It's actually still our model underneath. It's just that other people outside the company have gone and built more and more elaborate sort of scaffolds or environments, et cetera, but the underlying model actually hasn't changed at all, which just shows that there's that much intelligence left untapped in the models. In terms of Anthropic, at our base, like we want to be powering these companies, right? So the probably fastest growing editors in the world right now are Cursor and Windsurf. They both use Sonnet a ton. It's great that those things are happening outside the building because there's companies that are waking up every day and like they're entrepreneurs that like will live or die by the quality of like that exact product. And I think that's really powerful. The kinds of products we want to build, I think, are ones where we can push the bounds a little bit of what human to AI interaction looks like. Like my background is in human-computer interaction, and at the time I was like, well, what UI do we want? And now it's how do we present Claude in the right way? So we'll do that almost as a way of painting forward what could be in the industry, and then let the ecosystem of companies fill out everything else around us in terms of apps.
And what about on the consumer versus business side? I mean, historically, consumer is a really tough business to be in, but it's also where you have made your start. Today, we got a cadre of people paying $20 a month to either OpenAI or Anthropic or Microsoft or Google. You guys are probably the least known in the consumer set. Is that an important area? Is that an area we'll see more of from you all?
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways I think about that question. Like one is work, which is what our focus has been. We've taken an enterprise focus and a work focus from the beginning. Looks like work in the enterprise, but actually manifests itself in personal lives as well. As a pretty trivial example from my last weekend, I don't know how many of you do holiday cards. We do them every year. And every year there's the our kids in a new grade at school, like they give you like a PDF of like poorly formatted addresses, and like, great, I got 2 hours to go put these into my spreadsheet. I did it in 5 minutes with Claude, right? I was like, here's the PDF. Please extract these addresses. Here's the format it needs to be in here. One example, like go and enter in it, it outputs it. So that's like a consumer use case, but it's grounded in a lot of I was like watching it do this, and I was like, oh, all the things that we've been working on, like artifacts and CSV support and PDF multimodal. I was like, oh, it's all coming together for this like fairly like personal use case. So going into next year, I think we'll keep the focus on work and work adjacent things, but find ways in which it has relevance for people managing families, people doing things at home, people running small businesses, and expanding it that way. So that's like one area. And then you might ask like, why, if our focus has been on enterprise? I really notice when I go into conversations with CIOs and CTOs, the easiest conversations are the ones where the decision maker is already, oh, I love Claude. And you're like, well, you love Claude, your company doesn't use this yet, but you discovered it for some personal, maybe semi-professional use case, and that opens the door later. So I think it's important for us to have some play there. Do we need to be as big as Instagram was? Probably not to fulfill the mission, but we can't just be purely enterprise, or else we'll just have a much harder uphill climb on that side.
Because it does strike me, and they're totally different phenomenon, but they've happened fairly similarly, and you were starting to get at this. I remember the bring your own device, like what got phones into the enterprise wasn't enterprise like, these will be incredible mobile sales tools. I mean, there was a small amount of that with BlackBerry and Microsoft, but they would have only reached the C-suite. It was when everyone got their first iPhone or Android and was like, I have to bring these into work. It strikes me that it's not that dissimilar in the AI world where you have people using ChatGPT, maybe afraid to admit they're using it at work, or Claude or whatever. It's sort of driving the businesses, and the businesses are trying to figure out how do we make use of that.
And to connect to our first question around like usability and how undistributed that is, what we find, like we have Cloud for Enterprise, which is our sort of business product that gets deployed across organizations. All of our most successful Cloud for Enterprise deployments start with one person that was like the Claude crazy enthusiast that was maybe the initial connection, and often they find themselves being an informal sort of like internal evangelist storyteller. Like they'll go and like, no, I've created like 5 perfect projects that will help you get started. And it's like, they're not doing it because of anything else that they see the potential for it, but then it all of a sudden unlocks how other people see it at that organization as well.
And maybe, and I probably should have done this at the beginning, but maybe describe how you think of Anthropic. Like, I feel like Anthropic tends to come up, a lot of former OpenAI people, a lot of people left because they weren't sure if OpenAI was sticking to the mission. Anthropic's more safety conscious. But that tells you what Anthropic isn't.
Yeah.
It maybe describes it. What is Anthropic?
Yeah, I think fundamentally Anthropic, at its core, both like in mission, but also like in how I've experienced it and what attracted me to it, is founded on the belief that you can build AI in a way that's both responsible to society and from a catastrophic risk perspective in the long run, but do it while still building great models and great products. Now, that's often the harder path. I can give a couple examples, but kind of showing that you can do both, and then leading by that example.
Well, maybe talk, one example, I don't know if it's one you would have brought up, is computer use. Because one of the big things, again, we've talked about agents a bunch today, letting the chatbot break free of that and make use of the computer is a pretty big elevation of its control. So Anthropic and others are starting to let you use the computer's power. It doesn't just have to return an answer, but it can go do something. Google has a plugin it's testing for Chrome. Talk about how you guys can be more focused on long-term safety and still at the leading edge of that sort of agentic, letting your, giving Claude access to the whole computer.
Yeah, that one's a great example. So that came out with the release of our newest Sonnet models about 2 months ago. And the capabilities were ready and could have been launched. But it was, the estimated launch date was like a week before the election. And we're like, we cannot put out a model that is going to use computers and not be thoughtful about the fact that there is an election in the world's largest democracy. So we spent a bunch of time actually, not on the model side, but actually on the trust and safety side, figuring out, all right, what is the model doing? And we have to build these like in a really sort of like additional complexity way, which is privacy preserving. So in a privacy preserving way, what is the model out and doing? And if it looked at all like it was doing signing up for voter roll registration or, like getting in touch with candidates, we're like, you know what, like there's like, here's a place where we'll actually opt for a little bit more caution than anything else. Like we're just gonna like disallow that or at least flag it. And it was like delayed the launch by a couple of weeks, but it was like, I think completely the right decision from that regard. So that was a very conscious decision on how you go out. And the second one, beyond just like how we've described this computer use, is like it's still very early. Like we don't think you should drive your Mac necessarily without some other controls. Like the products we are experimenting with building, I liken it much more. And if you've like owned a Tesla, you've gone through this whole evolution of like, there's a point where like it's both hands on the wheel for even like autopilot on the highway, and then eventually it gets like more like, all right, well, as long as you're checking in every once in a while, I'm comfortable with it. So one of our most promising internal prototypes, Claude is suggesting what to do next, but there's a final moment where you kind of like just click it and say like, okay, yes, I do want you to type this in. I do want you to submit a form. And then what we hope to do over time is make that more nuanced. So if you're just opening Chrome, fine, go open Chrome. If you're about to submit my credit card, I definitely want you to check in with me. And so one of the major areas of research we have, we think about human oversight. So how do models understand what they're doing, and what point do they want to check in with people? And I think that's a way where you can build more agentic, more computer use behavior, but still do it in a way that's very linked to how people think of how they want these models to behave.
And do you think the technology is broadly good enough to be giving it? There's a lot of talk about agents and giving more power to the chatbots. I still see a lot of hallucinations, a lot of things that a human can easily solve, or less and less, because one of the things that's hard about chatbots is they're convincing even when they're wrong. But at least if you have a human there, there's a chance of detection. I do worry about the compound effect of, as soon as you get agents, then you soon get agents talking to agents. Do you feel like we're on a safe path for all that?
I think next year there's a lot. I don't think we're there with today's models. I'll start with that. I think a lot of the work that has to happen between now and then, I think is fairly defined. I think the human oversight that I mentioned, I think just improving the planning abilities of these models a bit more. I think right now they can make plans, but then they sometimes rabbit hole into something like, oh, that wasn't necessarily the right way approach. Giving the models access to tools, but doing it in a way that's thoughtful. So we open sourced a protocol that is all about how the models interact with the world and how the world interacts with the model. Because we think, sure, that benefits cloud, but we actually want to make that an open standard. And again, if you do that correctly, then there's well-known authentication and well-known security around that versus a little bit more of a agentic free-for-all, which is maybe more dangerous. So I think there are core pieces that need to happen. And then the last one, and this is a combination, and this is why I think this work is really fun. It brings everything together. It's a combination model, product, and sort of trust and safety perspective, which is how do you supervise? What does the oversight look like when you aren't just asking for something and waiting between 3 seconds and a minute is the longest answer you're going to have right now, to hours? What does that UI look like? All of a sudden, a thing in my head is, do you start moving from typing requests into a chatbot and watching the answer to assigning tasks in a to-do list and then watching the model explain, all right, here are the 10 things I think I'm going to do to solve that to-do. And you're like, yeah, that seems reasonable, go. All right, I got stuck on this one because it needed your input. Okay, great, that's a nice time to do it. So I think before that work, I would not feel like agents are ready. But with that work, you can start imagining it take on some research tasks where it's not going off and creating a lot of change, but doing some agentic retrieval, preparing a presentation for you, perhaps. That took 8 steps, might have taken an hour, but is pointing the way to what happens when you give it a little bit more autonomy.
And you've made a couple allusions to self-driving cars, and I think it is a really good analogy. One of the problems that the auto industry has dealt with is, it's one thing if the car can drive itself entirely. It's another thing if the human's entirely in control. There's a lot of nuance and challenge when the human doesn't need to be fully in control, but they kind of do. Yeah. Is there a similar thing in AI where the UI gets so good and people get so used to clicking OK, which we all know. I mean, you see that pop-up come up and say accept cookies, your cookie monster there, hitting accept cookies. Is there a similar thing in AI interfaces that we need to be cautious of?
I think so. I mean, even the open source project I mentioned is called the Model Context Protocol. And in our initial implementation, it asks you before it uses every tool. And you can say, yes, and don't ask me again for this chat. And of course, you're like, yeah, okay, just go. So I've seen it exactly what you're describing. It's very human nature. I think that is partially a research question, which is, can we have it ask for permission when it deems that there's something that is potentially a bigger thing?
And maybe explain why.
And maybe explain exactly why. This, and actually not just go yes or no, or hey, this is a little bit more nuanced, And I remember Microsoft got a lot of flack when that was that version of Windows that would hard interrupt you and ask yes, no questions. At some point you develop that clicking instinct. So you're asking a very good question, and it's on our minds around what is the right model of interaction for confirmation and destructive, or we call them destructive actions in HCI, but bigger actions that aren't undoable.
We only have about a minute left. I'd love to leave people, this is the last full segment, we have one more demo after this. What do you think is something that isn't possible today, but you can see by the time we get together next year, celebrating the holidays, we're going to be doing with AI that we can barely imagine we're doing today?
All right, I'll do 2 topical ones and I'll be quick. One is I dream of the day where the holiday card process is just please I'll even give you the PDF, but go look at what we did this year, like maybe do a first draft in our voice. We actually did Claude for a lot of our writing. Like a spoiler alert, if you get one of our holiday cards, like it was at least half Claude written, but edited, but like end to end, like get me mostly there so I'm not like clicking on a bunch of things. So that's one piece. The other one is, I've moved from Instagram where like it's very consumer and you're meeting individual users, but they're not like business meetings, to a world where I'm doing a lot more external meetings with clients or potential customers. And a lot of my time is like, all right, who am I meeting? What did they do? Who's this customer? Like, what's their journey? What is even this industry about? And like, I just want like show up in the morning and be like, Claude has researched everything and has given me like individual like briefings for each of those, and I don't even have to think about it. And I can just be present to the meeting and not like be like, what was this company again and what did they do? So those are two that I think are very, very.
Well, I mean, I think that's pretty exciting. Help with your holiday cards and tell you who's in that meeting. So that's an exciting feature. Thank you so much,
Thank you so
Mike
much.
Krieger.